It sounds like there's dissatisfaction with the stablecoin bill, market structure bill, and the Bitcoin Act.
And we need to protect our access to wallets, our freedom to actually be able to transact and use Bitcoin.
Why go through the regulatory apparatus, or why does that need to be done?
None of those people, myself included, are going to risk going to prison in the United States for this. And this seems like a fairly likely way for them to come after us, because we have a lot of people who care deeply about this. And frankly, we, as a crypto industry, we need to make clear to Congress that
Permissionless, the crypto industry's leading developer conference, is coming to Brooklyn this June 24th to the 26th, and this time Bitcoin is showing up in a big way. That's right, with confidence in Ethereum and Solana on the decline, interest in Bitcoin development is riding high, and yet the way forward for many builders remains unclear. Layer 2s, meta protocols, soft fork upgrades. We'll be talking about the future of Bitcoin and how and if it needs to change. Of course, tickets are going fast. You can get them today at blockworks.co. We'll see you there. This episode of Supply Shock is brought to you by Ledn, a proud Bitcoin-only company and the global leader in Bitcoin-backed lending. Need cash but don't want to sell down your Bitcoin stack? Ledn has a trusted track record in providing liquidity. That's Ledn. You'll hear more about them later in this episode. Nothing said on Supply Shock is a recommendation to buy or sell any investments or products. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and the views expressed by anyone on the show are solely their opinions, not financial advice or necessarily the views of Blockworks. Our hosts, guests, and the Blockworks team may hold positions in the company's funds or projects discussed. Hey everyone, Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian here. On today's episode of Supply Shock, we're bringing on one of the longest tenured Bitcoin developers, someone whose work dates back to his time all the way back in high school. As a former member of Bitcoin Core, he contributed to Bitcoin's development and security reviews with nearly 300 merged pull requests. He also developed Fiber and Better Hash protocols to fight against mining centralization, working on Rust, Lightning, and other projects. Today, he's a full-time open source engineer at Spiral, and he's leading the effort to change public policy about self-custody wallets with SaveYourWallets.org. Welcome to the podcast, Matt Corallo, the Blue Matt.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. You're
Well,
always
Matt,
very excited, Pete.
I am. Well, there's lots going on in Bitcoin, right? We're going mainstream. It feels like a watershed moment. We just saw each other at Bitcoin 2025, which, was certainly unlike any conference that me and you would have been at back in the day, right? We sort of went from these kind of dusty back rooms of universities to, this was a large scale Vegas show with regulators. So yeah, maybe we start there. Your thoughts on whether this conference, is mainstream? Have we made it?
It's an interesting position to be in, that we can fill a conference hall, that we can fill a Vegas casino conference hall, I guess, with people, or close to fill it. I don't know if they sold out on tickets, but they had a lot of people there uh, who care about Bitcoin. I think people there, probably a good chunk of them just want to make money on Bitcoin, but I think certainly it's the case that for the most part they care about Bitcoin. They value at least some of the properties of it. They value, probably the censorship resistance, at least in part. Certainly the value number go up, but I think there's a decent chunk that value Bitcoin's properties in a useful way.
Well, a big thing
Um,
about the conference was regulatory involvement. Day one was pretty packed. You saw Eric Trump, Donald Trump Jr. We had Vice President J.D. Vance, of course. Let's talk about SaveYourWallets.org first, or SaveOurWallets.org first.
Save our wallets, yeah.
Yeah, .org first. So this is an effort that's really come to sort of fill in the cracks of some of this legislation, because it sounds like there's dissatisfaction with the stablecoin bill, market structure bill, and the Bitcoin Act, where there's some leftover space there. Maybe you can speak to what's not being covered by sort of these three larger acts that people are familiar with.
Yeah. So I think many of your viewers are probably familiar with the Tornado Cash case and the Samurai Wallet cases. So in these cases, the United States government alleged that these entities, despite being non-custodial, despite not being responsible for people's funds in any way, they don't have any ability to seize, freeze, or kind of do anything to people's funds. The United States government alleged that they were money transmitters, so they were basically subject to the same regulation that a totally fiduciary financial firm that actually holds all your money is uh, subject to, at least in regards to KYC, AML. They have to register, get a license. They have to subject themselves to yearly examinations to make sure their KYC and AML programs are up to par. I mean, obviously, it makes no sense, right? They can't do any of these things. They're non-custodial wallets, um, or non-custodial contracts in the Tornado Cash case. So, yeah, these charges made no sense. They're still being fought in court. The current administration, the Trump administration, has walked back some of the charges, not all of the charges related to money transmission. There's some other charges related to uh, money laundering that are maybe less applicable broadly, but more specific to those cases. Um, but so the Trump administration hasn't fully walked back all the money transmission charges, but much more importantly, even if they do walk those charges back, the laws they were charged with are still in the books, right? So the next administration, whether it's someone who's lukewarm on crypto or whether it's, President AOC or President Elizabeth Warren, can totally come after us with these things. And look, the Overton window on how to come after crypto has shifted, right? So in the last administration, the SEC was banging in doors and going after people for securities regulations. That doesn't really affect Bitcoin to begin with, but even if it did, they weren't necessarily winning in court. They were not doing too well, honestly. Um, and so, what the next administration, assuming they're not super pro crypto, is going to come after us with something different. And this seems like a fairly likely way for them to come after us. And they're not charges we can defend. I mean, the charges make no sense, but the law is broad. And the DOJ said that, well, a frying pan transfers heat and an Ethernet cable transfers data. So basically, anything involved in anything is a money transmitter. Um, and very specifically in our case, this impacts every L2 in all of cryptocurrency. Every L2 has some ancillary service. So they're not custodial. Sometimes there's a decentralized network. Sometimes it's some kind of centralized individual or centralized entity. But there's always something that helps coordinate, helps relay a payment, helps um, monitor, does fraud proof, whatever it is. That entity is still involved in some way and is potentially subject to this line of reasoning that the DOJ was pushing. Um, so really, we need to get the law changed.
Let me maybe kind of make an assertion here and see where you can take from this. Where I think there's been a lot of activity at the local level and federal level. This idea that you can run a node within the Bitcoin network, that's been enshrined in law in several states. There's kind of the right to run a node. There's the right to self custody Bitcoin, and in some cases the right to mine. Right. So these are all sort of basic activities of the network. So it sounds like what you're saying is that some of these processes that are kind of on top of that, where maybe if you're running a node or a miner or something like that, in order to provide a service or some sort of to help facilitate the network, this is really kind of the red line that you're looking at.
Yeah, so first of all, there's no federal law enshrining the right to mine or the right to run a node or anything like that. But those are a little less concerning. What I'm really worried about is L2s. Whether it's rollups, Lightning, Ark, Spark, whatever, all these L2s, these right to self custody. Well, just because you have a right to hold the keys to your coins on chain doesn't mean I have the right to run a lightning node that has a channel with you. um and if those activities are banned, these ancillary services to non-custodial wallets are banned, then okay, maybe people can still hold their money on chain, but as we all know, just having on-chain Bitcoin is not a really great user experience. We really need more than just on-chain.
Is it really a question whether they'll be banned, or it's just that they'll be regulated? Like maybe this, running a Lightning node could be viewed as a money services business or something. Is that the threat, or is it, or are you worried about a ban?
It's not really practical to comply with these laws, so if they were to be regulated as money transmitters, I think it is a de facto ban. Um, Having to do KYC AML in a Bitcoin L2 just means that people will move offshore, operate these things, develop these things outside of the United States, and they'll just block Americans. Americans simply won't have access to these things because it's not really possible. You can't build a comprehensive AML system or a comprehensive KYC system, much more importantly, on top of the Lightning Network. It's not built for it. You can't do it. You could, you know, do AML at the edges. You know, if you're a custodial wallet, you're somebody like Cash App, you can do a good bit of AML monitoring the transactions that come to you. But as a routing node, there's not a lot you can do. And it's not really shouldn't be your job. You know, the people who want to address money laundering are these large custodial entities that people use a lot. Um, and so it's not the purpose of the peer-to-peer network to defend that.
They call it the hodler's dilemma. Ever wish you could get access to cash without selling down your stack? Well, Ledn makes that possible. Since 2018, Ledn has issued over $9 billion worth of Bitcoin-backed loans, and they haven't lost a single satoshi of client funds in the process. There are no credit checks. You can get funds in under 12 hours and repay whenever you want with zero penalties. Unlike others, Ledn doesn't lend out your collateral. They even publish biannual proof of reserves verified by top auditors in the blockchain. You can learn more at ledn.io. That's ledn.io. As always, investments in blockchain technology involve risks. Terms and conditions may apply. Do your own research. So the imagery here is save our wallets. So maybe you can speak. Why use that kind of terminology if what we're talking about here really is maybe secondary layer or different types of services?
Yeah, I mean, I think the future of Bitcoin and all cryptocurrency is on L2 of various forms. Certainly, it's the only way we have to scale any cryptocurrency is L2s, and there's many different kinds of L2s, many ideas for how to build the best L2s, whatever it is. But that's clearly the future of how people interact with cryptocurrency is via Lightning, Ark, Spark, rollups, whatever it is. And if those are banned in the United States or de facto unavailable in the United States, aren't serviced for Americans, then Americans simply won't have access to decent wallets. We'll have only on-chain, very expensive and slow transactions that nobody wants to use.
Interesting. So, in terms of the kind of fight to kind of advance this, so the bill has been drafted and introduced. What is next in terms of making this a priority? What can you do, and what are you doing?
Yeah, so there's the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act. It's a straightforward two-pager. Like anyone can read it, anyone can understand it. There's nothing crazy in there. Um, that was introduced by Congress persons Emmer, who's the Majority Whip, the House Majority Whip, and Richie Torres, who's the Congressperson, the Democratic Congressperson from the Bronx in New York. They co-introduced this act in the House, so it is up for discussion, analysis in the House. I don't believe it's gone to committee yet. Um, and then we need corresponding Senate bill. There's a lot of questions in Congress about how to best get things passed. Standalone bill is a part of some larger omnibus. Which larger omnibus? There's complexity there that I'll let Congress deal with. But we really, as a community, we need to make clear that this matters to us, because we do have some political power. We have some pull as an industry, and we can get Congress to do stuff. We have a lot of voters. We have a lot of people who care deeply about this, and frankly, we, as a crypto industry, not necessarily Bitcoin, spend a lot of money on politics. Um, so we have some leverage, but we have to make clear that this is our goal. You mentioned at the open, there's a few other bills going on right now. There's the market structure legislation around tokens and SEC and securities regulation. There's a stablecoin bill around regulating stablecoins. Neither of these impact Bitcoin in the slightest. And both of them, they change the status quo a little bit, but honestly, not all that much. Whereas the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act, if we don't fix this, we saw Phoenix Wallet, a popular Lightning wallet, leave the U.S. after the Samurai prosecution came out. They recently re-entered the U.S. market because the Trump administration walked back some of those charges, but the next administration can undo that, right? So if we don't want that to happen again in the next administration, we need to make clear to Congress that this is our fight. This is the one that we need them to pass. We care deeply about this. We need to protect uh, wallet developers, we need to protect open source developers, and we need to protect our access to wallets, our freedom to actually be able to transact and use Bitcoin in an interesting way that has decent user experience.
Maybe let me ask you, why is this of interest to yourself? You're primarily, or I think of you as a technologist, right? You're someone who wants to kind of build things that kind of route around problems like this. Why go through the regulatory apparatus, or why does that need to be done?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, a lot of Bitcoiners view interacting with the government through questionable, through with a lot of derision, with a lot of questions around that. I mean, look, at the end of the day, I want to help operate these services. I want to partner with people who operate these services. I want to access these services. And none of those people, myself included, are going to risk going to prison in the United States for this. It's great that Bitcoin provides an alternative and people can use it even in the face of a government that disagrees with them, tries to prevent it. But there are limits to this. And when we're asking developers to take on legal risk or service operators to take on legal risk of going to prison in the United States, they're just not going to do it. So while that doesn't mean that these things can't exist. Foreign companies can operate them and make them available. Probably they won't make them available to Americans because, unlike Iran, North Korea, even China, the long arm of the US law will happily pull someone out of Europe and arrest them for it, will happily pull someone out of most countries in the world. And so, yes, these things could in theory exist, but the reality is the talent pool is in the US, it's in Europe, it's in places where people aren't going to take the risk of servicing Americans with these kinds of take on these risks. If we only had developers sitting in Argentina, I guess, I don't know, do they still not have an extradition treaty with the US? If we only had developers sitting in a few countries, or if all the Bitcoin developers wanted to move to Iran, then maybe it wouldn't be a problem. But I don't think that's likely.
Well, I want to pick at your language there a little bit because I think you've used a lot of interesting descriptions of the law and sort of why we need it, and this kind of dovetails with the conversation that we've had a lot lately, which is sort of this idea that the Bitcoin culture has sort of norms and expectations, right? And it seems like the kind of people that you're advocating to come support this initiative, kind of the larger Bitcoin populace, I would say that there's more of a kind of understanding that or kind of a belief that Bitcoin is, the only decentralized cryptocurrency, that it's sufficiently decentralized, and that maybe it doesn't need to scale. I think we can quibble with those, ideas, but it does seem like that has become sort of the normative view of Bitcoin, right? You can even look at the statements that the federal government is making, right? You're seeing people like Bo Hines and David Sachs say that Bitcoin had an immaculate conception. It's unequivocally different from other cryptocurrencies. There was even Bo Hines who came out and said that he believes Bitcoin will run for hundreds of years, right? So this is kind of the memetics kind of playing out their higher level, right? The Bitcoin culture seems to believe these things. Politicians are learning from kind of the people who have these beliefs. Maybe we can start a conversation here about what is your view on these beliefs as someone who's been in the technology ecosystem for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, Bitcoin's obviously had a long arc of, when Bitcoin started, there was a lot more interest in payments. That waned a little bit. Um, but I mean, to your point about Vegas and the conference this year, there did seem to be a bit of a return to an interest in payments. Yes, it's true that a lot of the politicians and um, you know, various kind of sailor folks who've been around for less time were talking about, Bitcoin as number go up, Bitcoin is just a way to hedge the dollar, a way to investment, an investment vehicle, whatever. But at the same time, there were, Square announced that it was going to start taking Bitcoin again with Lightning. Uh, Block also announced or published statistics on their increase in Lightning transaction volumes. They said that their Lightning withdrawals from Cash App, i.e., really payments that people are making with Bitcoin, have gone up 9 times in the last year. 9x increase. That's a wild stat. And when you add that together with they also said, Miles said on stage, that Cash App is regularly doing 10% of total Bitcoin block space. Mm. With efficient transactions, not being super block space inefficient or something. They're doing 10% of Bitcoin transaction volume with fairly compressed transactions. So that gives you a sense of the scale of how many payments Cash App users do. And then you're saying, okay, well, now 25% of those payments are going out via Lightning and it's growing at a crazy rate. Okay, yeah, a lot of people wrote Bitcoin off for payments for many reasons. Frankly, I think most of it was just because the user experience sucked. The user experience of making payments with Bitcoin sucked. You hit send on your wallet and your money disappeared, and you wouldn't get confirmations for 10 minutes, and the wallet on the other side might not display the transaction for 20, 30 seconds, and you're standing there wondering if your payment's going to go through, and you can't do it for in-person payments because the transaction won't confirm for 10 minutes or sometimes an hour. That user experience was unusably bad, right? And so suddenly with Lightning, and Lightning being actually readily available in a lot of wallets, but more importantly, working well. Payments are very reliable these days. They're quick, um, in a way that they haven't been up until fairly recently with Lightning. Um, Suddenly, the user experience is good. The user experience for Bitcoin payments is good enough that people actually want to pay in Bitcoin, and they actually are. And so I think we shouldn't lose sight of that just because, well, a year ago, when a lot of these people formed their opinions, they payments weren't really a thing in Bitcoin, and so people wrote it off.
Well, a lot of this, I think, is the what's happened in El Salvador, right, and that kind of not coming to fruition in the way people quite expected. But maybe we'll go back to the
Yeah,
start.
top down. I mean, top down forcing Bitcoin payments is not going to work. You can't force it top down. People have to actually want to use Bitcoin. They have to see it work well. I mean, the El Salvador Bitcoin stuff didn't work well to begin with.
Well,
There were
let's put
some
that
some
aside for a
bugs
second.
in the
Maybe let's
rollout,
maybe
but
let's start at the beginning here. So you've been in the Bitcoin development space for a while. So there's this idea of the immaculate conception, right? That has become very in vogue, right? It's this idea that Bitcoin has some sort of kind of unique genesis that can't be replicated by any other cryptocurrency project. Is that a view that you have, that this is a technically accurate description of Bitcoin?
yeah, I mean, I think obviously Bitcoin's sounding story is very different from most other cryptocurrencies, probably all other cryptocurrencies at this point. That doesn't necessarily mean that another cryptocurrency couldn't be built in the same way, but there's very strong incentives not to. People make a lot of money issuing a crypto.
Well, this tends to be like a big fissure point in the community, right? Like the mere suggestion these days that Bitcoin, something else could compete with Bitcoin is pretty much denounced instantaneously. Paul Storks yesterday
Yeah,
coming out and saying that to Lynn Alden was effectively sort of denounced by a lot of people. But again, this just sort of speaks to the mass psychology here, is that, you know, again, Bitcoin has this immaculate conception and therefore is different from all other cryptocurrencies by default. So I guess again, I'm sort of asking, like, is that something you agree with?
yeah, yeah. I don't think it's because of some immaculate conception, though. Like, okay, that's maybe a little part of it, and that does separate it a little bit. But I think what really separates Bitcoin is that we deal with it differently. We build it differently. Every other cryptocurrency takes trade-offs on centralization that often trade off censorship resistance in order to get user experience properties that they want. Better scalability, faster transactions, maybe more featureful transactions, lots of user experience goals that they have that Bitcoin doesn't bother with, right? That we say, okay, well, you know, there's some interesting value in doing those other things. If you want to have faster transactions, cheaper transactions, more featureful transactions, whatever, that has value to the marketplace. Clearly, some people buy these other cryptocurrencies, build things on top of them, use those things built on top of them. But Bitcoin isn't competing with that, right? So Bitcoin is, I don't, it's not to say that nothing could, but I don't think anyone is even trying to compete with Bitcoin for these things. No one is trying to compete with Bitcoin for We are going to be the most decentralized we can be. We're not going to compromise on that at all. We're not going to compromise on censorship resistance or our goals. We're going to shoot for that goal singularly, and all these other things we can figure out separately. So, these payments, whatever people want to do, fast transactions on Bitcoin, we'll figure those out separately. That'll be on Lightning, that'll be on L2s. Um, other cryptocurrencies have kind of come around that view a little bit, but they're still not on we are not going to compromise on our top line goal of decentralization at all. That's
Well,
not
that was
a
the same
thing
from
for any
the
other
Ethereum
cryptocurrency.
camp, right? Is that you could start centralized and kind of become decentralized, and sort of in their sort of worldview, they are becoming more decentralized and potentially even achieving that.
Maybe, but I don't really buy that that's their singular goal. I mean, you look at Mev, you look at their approach to it, you look at, it's still one of several goals, right? At the end of the day, it's still, they also have the goal of cheap transactions. They also have the goal, and they're not really succeeding at that goal, but they also have the goal of scalability. They also have the goal. They have these other goals that they're trying to balance decentralization with, and that's different than Bitcoin.
Right. So, okay. So we dealt with the immaculate conception issue, but maybe kind of branching off of this further. There's this idea that Bitcoin is decentralized, and there's been a lot of difference in language kind of over the years on this. Right. A lot of developers, I think, used to be more comfortable kind of speaking about Bitcoin as something that was aspirationally becoming decentralized. That there were kind of centralization points in the network. Maybe not like being as forward as declaring that it was decentralized. So a good example would be, from this kind of 2014, 2013 era, there was a big concern about kind of mining pool centralization. Peter Todd famously kind of selling off half of his Bitcoin over concerns that Bitcoin was no longer decentralized. So it used to be pretty normative for developers to kind of talk about Bitcoin, maybe not being decentralized or decentralization being aspirational. So I guess maybe a second way to ask this question would be, are we still aspiring for decentralization or in your view, or have we achieved it currently?
Yeah, I mean, clearly we're not at the point we want to be at. I don't think that invalidates the point that we don't trade things off we don't trade that off to get other things, right? We don't make decisions that trade off the decentralization we do have or our ability to get future decentralization in order to get some other features. I think that's the distinguishing characteristic of Bitcoin. But that's not to say that we're decentralized in the way that we want to be, clearly. We clearly need to deploy, you mentioned Better Hash, the more recent version of that being Stratum v2. We need to get miners to decentralize how they do transaction selection. Um, but if we just get that, we're doing pretty good. The reality is that the actual hash rate, actual ASICs on the ground, and the ownership of them is pretty decentralized. There are a lot of companies who participate. They're in a lot of different countries, and hash rate itself is not, it could be more decentralized, but it is fairly decentralized. Is really quite decentralized, um, and so it's really that top line issue. If we address that top line issue and we get miners picking their own transactions that go in their blocks rather than the pools, we're doing pretty good. It's not perfect. Nothing is not never going to be perfect. There'll always be improvements we want to make, but we would be doing pretty good,
Hmm. Well, maybe
and we're
we could
making progress towards it.
maybe we could pick at like the modern kind of Bitcoin cultural fissions and sort of say that right now there's kind of this division in the Bitcoin kind of worldview between people with different camps and different ideas. But one of them seems pretty dissatisfied with the idea that there is a single kind of Bitcoin core implementation. Of course, there's a ton of historical baggage with me even just saying that, and that technically there are multiple implementations. Just pretty discouraged to use them because they're not viewed as secure because of the nature of the consensus code within Bitcoin not being perhaps sufficiently well understood. What is your view about this idea that maybe we are moving towards something like multiple implementations? What's your view on that?
Yeah, maybe. It's weird because no one is actually really seems to be trying to adopt different implementations that are truly, a different code base. They exist. There's like BTCD, there's libbitcoin. BTC, I think libbitcoin is actually the only one that really has material maintenance, because BTCD has a little just enough maintenance that it doesn't, crash and burn, but it certainly doesn't have any full-time developers. Maybe it has one now. I don't think so though. Whereas, libbitcoin has had full-time developers for a while, and quite a few of them. But no one seems to care. No one seems to want to run libbitcoin. There's there's always in Bitcoin, there's always been a protest vote of various forms. There's always been groups who disagree with this or that or whatever, and then they all kind of conglomerate and they're all like, we're going to agree to protest. We saw with Bcash, after Bitcoin Cash split off, once they renamed Bitcoin Cash from Bcash, they then immediately split into what, three different currencies now? Are there four? Are there four
Yeah,
tokens?
there
I don't
was a
know.
subsequent Bitcoin Cash fork thereafter, but I can't remember the other currency.
There's SV, there's
Oh, Bitcoin has
ABC,
to be
there's
yeah,
I
right.
don't know. There's a few of them, right? Um, and so we saw that protest votes splinter after they have to actually make decisions because they're a protest vote. They don't have a cohesive ideology. And so again, we see, a protest vote for uh we see various protest votes, but they're not don't seem to be actually resourcing a full node that they want to
Well, I guess
run.
what I was
Like,
to ask you,
it's
how,
very expensive.
if you were to make the argument that Bitcoin development is sufficiently decentralized, what would be how would you make that argument?
Oh, I certainly think it is. I mean, there's a lot of different people who often disagree with each other who work together on Bitcoin development. Um, they- things can always be better, right? We could have more people in more countries, but we have a number of people in a number of different countries. We have a lot of smart people across a lot of organizations across a lot of countries working on Bitcoin Core mostly, but also Lightning and various other things. And so, like, I think Bitcoin development is very decentralized, and has been trending more and more decentralized stably over time, which has been great. So I'm not really worried about, the fact that they all happen to work on the same project was like, okay, they choose to do that. They're all, as long as they're all independently able to choose whether or not they work on Bitcoin Core, and I think they are basically all universally. If they had some good reason why they said like, Bitcoin Core is bad now, I don't want to use it, I don't want to work on it anymore, they could switch. Um, and so I think like the reality is like, okay, yeah, so what, they work in the same project, they choose to, and as long as they're choosing to, that's great, it's fine, it's the even better, it means we're not wasting a bunch of resources building five full nodes.
Let's take a quick break to talk about today's sponsor, Ledn, the most trusted name in Bitcoin-backed lending. Look, if you're like me, you never really want to think about selling your Bitcoin. Ledn has a solution. You can borrow against your Bitcoin. No credit checks, no monthly payments, no hidden fees. You can get your cash in under 12 hours and pay back when you want with zero penalties. Unlike other platforms, Ledn has a history of transparency. They prove it with independent proof of reserves audits every 6 months on the blockchain. In total, they've issued more than $9 billion in loans without losing a single Satoshi of client funds. That's the kind of track record you want when it comes to securing your Bitcoin. You can learn more. Visit ledn.io. That's ledn.io. As always, investments in blockchain technology involve risks. Terms and conditions may apply. Do your own research. I would posit there's at least one pretty big difference between the current, kind of Bitcoin core process and maybe the process of the past, right? And maybe if you think kind of before 2016, 2017, there was sort of an active roadmap for Bitcoin Core, right? First, there was sort of a roadmap maintained by Gavin Andresen and the Bitcoin Foundation, and then thereafter, Gregory Maxwell authoring, a roadmap to enact SegWit and some other things, right? There were sort of grassroots efforts to get developers kind of aligned behind some sort of forward vision of like where Bitcoin was going. And I think, for better or for worse, as much as those efforts kind of coordinated, people's talents and abilities, there was sort of this impression created that Bitcoin Core, the software developers were sort of moving forward or managing the project in some way. Reflecting on that past, I do you agree with this kind of difference, and what do you see as as what's happening now, where maybe there isn't kind of a active roadmap. As a casual observer, I would just say, it used to feel like Bitcoin Core sort of was in a process to develop and achieve something, and then there was kind of like a defined, at least publicly maintained view of that. Whereas it seems like for the last, 5 or 8 years that has sort of lapsed.
I think, okay, you're right that Gavin tried to more actively manage Bitcoin Core, tried to more actively decide where things were going. Um, that is part of probably the reason why he doesn't work on Bitcoin Core anymore or Bitcoin is that that Bitcoin development is decentralized, and if you try to tell everyone what to do, they're gonna say no, fuck you, because we disagree with you. I think when you look at like Gregory Maxwell's posts on the he had one, I think there's just really one famous post that you're referring to, which was kind of the roadmap post on how to scale Bitcoin, etc. For the most part, I don't think that that was Greg saying, here's how we should scale Bitcoin, but rather Greg saying, when I go around and talk to all the other Bitcoin Core developers, here's what everyone seems to be thinking of how we scale Bitcoin. And those are two very different things because the second one doesn't imply active management.
Even that second process is a little absent, though.
Sure, but that's a lack of communication, not a lack of, it's like his post wasn't because there was some kind of active management of Bitcoin going on, of Bitcoin Core going on. It was him just communicating to the world, like, okay, when I go out and poll the Bitcoin Core developers, here's kind of what I get back. Now that is missing. I agree that that should exist. Like, there should be more of that kind of information coming from Bitcoin Core, but that's not because Bitcoin Core is somehow maintained differently. It just means that it's not really well actively communicated.
I've also had a number of conversations with Bitcoin developers, some of whom are affiliated with Core, some of whom are not, but who tend to kind of espouse this view that the project had a more active leadership back in the day, and that there was a vision that they feel perhaps is no longer around. I've asked them to sort of define this vision a few different times, and I think I haven't really gotten a great answer. Probably the best answer that I had was that perhaps of that era there was this idea that Bitcoin was kind of a project that was a work in progress. The vision was to take what Satoshi kind of started, and then to have a Bitcoin that was maximally decentralized, maximally scalable, and maximally private. Sort of the kind of holy grail of Bitcoin, right? This idea that this network that had these known limitations, that as more users kind of get on board, has centralization pressures, would find a way to kind of overcome those, and maybe mask some of the deficiencies in the features that were revealed through the excavation of Satoshi's code. Do you feel like you have a good idea of what the vision of the time was, or what people are speaking to when they're saying that they don't feel like there's maybe a forward direction in the way that there used to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely the case that Bitcoin development has shifted in its focus. I think, I mean, part of the reality is that right after SegWit, a lot of people were really burnt out and stopped working on Bitcoin. And then while Craig Wright was suing people, more people were burnt out and didn't want to work on Bitcoin. Um, and so, that did suck a lot of air out of the room. Luckily, I think both of those have largely passed us. Craig Wright, knock on wood, is seems to be gone now. Seems to have lost access to whoever was funding his attacks
Yeah,
on
it seems like the
Bitcoin.
case of the UK, he's unable to file a lawsuit for at least the next couple of years. So that's good.
Not in the UK, yeah, but it seems like also his access to money to pay for lawyers has dried up a little bit. Which is the most important thing. Somebody needs to stop wasting money on lawyers for him. But I think that that's dried up a little bit. I think it is the case that in the interim, Bitcoin Core and Bitcoin development broadly has shifted a little bit towards, Bitcoin Core has to provide a stable platform for Lightning and other potential future L2s. rather than Bitcoin Core has to execute on changing Bitcoin in ways that make it more private or decentralized or whatever. Um, for better or for worse, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Bitcoin is what, two orders of magnitude more valuable than it was when these
Right.
conversations were
I was gonna
happening.
counter with my own observation, which is I do feel like, if I think about the 2014 and 2017 era, and you think about, history has a lot of these interesting things where sometimes you just find that people broadly believe something, and just that you find out in the future, that just wasn't true, right? So there's a lot of instances of this, but something I think a lot about is that I think during kind of the fork war period, there was a big belief that kind of technical development was driving kind of the price appreciation of Bitcoin, that there was some sort of relationship between, the actual project's development and then the development of the economy on it. It seems like, two Bitcoin cycles removed from that, there is no longer that confidence, right? I think if you ask most people today, they would say that Bitcoin's price appreciation seems largely divorced from the technical development. What's your view
Right.
on that?
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely, the value proposition of Bitcoin to an investor who's going to put $100 million into Bitcoin has nothing to do with the Lightning Network or whatever. Now, the value proposition of Bitcoin to the next 100 million people who are going to use Bitcoin has a lot to do with the Lightning Network. And I think those 100 million people are more valuable for Bitcoin than the person who's going to put $100 million into Bitcoin. But the short term and the people who are putting capital into Bitcoin today couldn't care less about a lot of the development focus. Aside from that, it keeps working, that it keeps being stable and well maintained. Um, Bitcoin Core continuing to address security issues and issues before they slow down the network or cause problems on the network is very important to them. But Lightning development or whatever certainly doesn't matter to them.
But do you think it's fair to say there's a group of developers, however small, I think, who are sort of frustrated with what you just said, which is that it is true that Lightning required or benefited from technical core changes to the Bitcoin protocol, and if unlocking Lightning for 100 million users does add value to Bitcoin, it doesn't really seem very clear how one would be able to make or advance that kind of argument today. Because it seems like if you think of maybe the people who are largely dissatisfied with the current process, they seem to be advancing proposals that they think would sort of kind of have that next kind of leap, right? Again, like whether that's true or not, that's kind of their view and the language that they're using.
Yeah.
But it seems like those conversations are protracted and or not advancing in a significant way.
If there were a widespread agreement that these changes would enable a type of scaling that would immediately onboard a number of users, then I think they would probably move forward a lot quicker than they have been. But I don't think there's that widespread agreement. And in fact, I think there's widespread dubiousness of those claims, from multiple angles, right? Like, uh, are there 100 million people ready to start using Bitcoin tomorrow for daily payments if only the cost of onboarding to a wallet went down, to a non-custodial wallet went down by 10x? I mean, obviously not, because they're just using custodial wallets today and they don't care. um, and so there's skepticism there. There's also skepticism on the technical side of just like, are these really the delta in um, user experience that people claim they are? If there were widespread agreement on that, I think things would make more forward progress, but I just don't think it exists. So, yes, obviously, there's some of the folks who do believe that have expressed frustration in Bitcoin development, and often that comes in the form of feeling like, well, there used to be more active management, there used to be, people setting the bar for the approach that Bitcoin was taking to certain issues, and now those people don't exist. Yeah, that's kind of true. I think part of that's just a consequence of there's just less people working on Bitcoin than there used to, or more people working on Bitcoin than there used to be. Um, and so yeah, back in the day, you could talk to five people, convince them, and that was kind of it because that's just all the people who there were. And now you might have to talk to 20 people or 30 people. But most of the reality is just that, there's just skepticism that these ideas are not that they're good ideas necessarily, just that they're so important that people should stop what they're working on and work on those, or certainly devote substantial amounts of their time to these ideas. And I think there's just enough disagreement there that things haven't moved forward, and we shouldn't read. I- Too many people want to read a lot into that. I don't think we should read any more into that than that. That there's just not a level of agreement that people want to spend their time on these things today. Won't Doesn't mean anything for tomorrow, doesn't mean anything for other types of changes. That's just what it is.
You mentioned the L2s at the beginning when we were talking about Save Our Wallets and the efforts there. That you see kind of second layers becoming necessary for Bitcoin. You use that term pretty generally. Obviously, I think a lot of people know and have used the Lightning Network and are happy with it. We really haven't seen too many L2s outside of that. Obviously, people are pretty excited about Ark and some other ideas, but this these proposals seem pretty novel. BitVM, the same, I think, just tested for the first time this week, but still hasn't made a debut. What is your view of the L2s being built on top of Bitcoin? Is there something there that you like, or what's the like generally about what's being done?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ideas. I'm happy people are trying a lot of ideas. They obviously have different goals in many cases. So, um, BitVM and the roll-up approaches are largely focused on increasing the feature set of Bitcoin. So basically bringing DeFi to Bitcoin. Lots of people have lots of views on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not going to espouse any more on that.
You've had a lot of
But I think
podcasts
that's
about
that's
that.
right. I think that's the primary goal and certainly the thing that they're going to achieve the most directly. Um, Arc and other new systems are obviously targeted more at payments. Arc has a long way to go. Um, in a naive Arc, like naive, like OG as proposed Arc doesn't work at all. It just doesn't scale because of the liquidity requirements. And so the Arc startups that are building real practical Arc deployments today make a lot of other trade-offs. They make trade-offs around trust model. They're trying to add payment channels or Lightning on top as a way to fix the more fundamental issues in Arc. Um, so there's a lot of potential complexity there. We'll see how those end up working at the end of the day. Both in terms of once you add all that complexity, how what does it actually look like? Have you built something that is great, or do you still have some holes that cause problematic behavior? I mean, we struggled for how many years with Lightning, where just complexity at the protocol layer added would sometimes cause issues, which would then bubble up to the user experience layer, and the user experience sucked because oh, the protocol did this weird thing and it force closed because of this and yada yada yada. And the user's like, I don't know what just happened. I just paid a large fee and this is terrible. Why am I using this? Um, and so, Ark's got a ways to go. We'll see what happens. There's other designs people are working on which are trying to be more of a bridge between custodial and non-custodial. Basically, Liquid, eCash, and Spark now. Um, they're all heavily trusted. Liquid and eCash are custodial systems, but with different properties, slightly better privacy. Liquid obviously has a lot of signers. eCash systems have had trouble getting mints, getting people who want to operate those custodial entities. Um, Spark, on the other hand, is not really custodial, but definitely fully trusted and definitely not non-custodial. It's not self-custodial, but it's not really custodial either. So trying to find a middle ground and a trust model that makes sense. Um, they seem to be finding some success in terms of wallet adoption very, very early. They've only just launched. Um, but I think there's a lot of demand for something in that middle ground where it's fully trusted, but it's not quite custodial. It doesn't do KYC, and it allows you to have really low value balances. No matter what you do, if you have a really non-custodial system, you can't have, 10 sat, 100 sat balances. It just doesn't make sense because in order to be non-custodial, if you have some multi-party protocol, you have to be able to go to chain and prove that your counterparty misbehaved. Because they can always misbehave because it's not on chain to begin with. And so you have to be able to hit the chain. If you can't hit the chain, pay for the fees, and still have money left over, you're not non-custodial. And so there's some minimum threshold where you can actually practically be non-custodial. It's probably 10,000 sats or something. Your transactions are hundreds of sats at a minimum, if not thousands. Um, and you still want to have money left over after you transact. So it's, you have to have non-trivial number of sats before it makes sense to call a wallet non-custodial. It makes sense to even think about a non-custodial wallet. Um, and so I think, in the future, we're going to see wallets that try to bridge that gap. We're going to see wallets that have a non-custodial component. Basically, if your balance gets high enough, it automatically moves your money into that non-custodial component, and then have a custodial or at least trusted component. Whether it's Spark, Liquid, or eCash. Um, it'll store your money there until you get to some threshold where it makes sense to look at a non-custodial wallet. Um, and I think in that model, Lightning, even today's Lightning makes a lot of sense because, okay, the onboarding cost isn't free. We have to pay some transactions on chain to onboard you. And your LSP has to allocate a little bit of liquidity, although not very much in the custodian in this graduated wallet model. Um, but okay, we can just increase the threshold, right? We can just say, okay, well now you need 100,000 or 150,000 sats before your wallet goes to non-custodial. And oh, the on-chain fees went up. Well, we can increase that threshold a little more, or we can migrate you tomorrow when the fees are lower. Um, and so there's a lot of games you can play in that kind of model. I think that model's required for a wallet to make sense in the future. And once we are in that world, we get all these fun games we can play, and that lets us um, use some of these things that maybe people have written off, like non-custodial Lightning, where it's like, well, the user experience isn't very good because everyone wants to open a new wallet, connect it to their Noster, receive 21 sat zaps, and have a balance of 100 sats, and Lightning just doesn't work for that. But that's not Lightning's fault. No non-custodial system works for that. There's nothing you can do that's non-custodial at that balance. Um, so marrying trusted systems with untrusted systems gives us that good user experience that people want while enabling things to actually be trustless and really get the value of Bitcoin, at least once you have enough money for Bitcoin to be able to offer that service to you.
So we talked about the development process a little bit. The next sort of fissure I wanted to talk about within kind of the culture or the thinking these days seems to be this idea around valid transactions. That there's some transactions that we want on Bitcoin or that should be prioritized on Bitcoin. That there's some transactions that are just that people are making for things that maybe shouldn't be on Bitcoin. I know this is a complex one. I think it has to do with what people want to keep on their nodes versus developers kind of having a more maybe a more of a public health stance on just not wanting to kind of make a commentary on people's behavior, but just kind of looking at the network as a whole. What is your view on this idea that there are valid transactions in the Bitcoin network that are in fact harming it?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a reason why people make those arguments, and it's not completely nonsense, right? That like people could put data in the Bitcoin blockchain, which is illegal. People could uh,
Sorry,
fill the
it's
Bitcoin
illegal.
blockchain.
Sorry.
That's illegal, whether it's
Okay.
child porn, piracy, whatever. People can fill the blockchain with uh, things that crowd out financial use cases. Currently, there's not enough demand for block space for financial use cases to begin with, so no, so not a real risk of that. And it'd be nice if miners got paid, but there are valid arguments to be made there. I think what is obviously missed in a lot of those discussions is that there's nothing we can do about it. A lot of people raise this because they want the developers to do something. It's like the um, uh, why why do I have to deal with this stuff? The developers aren't doing anything to fight this. They should be doing more. And then people will swoop in and say like, ah, well, I have a solution. I'm a developer. I'm going to fight it for you. But the reality is there's nothing we can do. The miners are going to take what pays them. They have to, or they're going to go to business. That any miners who try to filter transactions in a meaningful way, they really materially reduce the set of transactions they accept, they just won't get paid as much and they'll go out of business. Blocking a transaction here or there, not really going to make a difference. There's another transaction right behind it that pays almost the same fee, fine, whatever. Um, but if we want to talk about 100%, if we want to talk about really blocking these transactions, we would talk about 100% of miners not including these transactions in their blocks. Well, there's going to be that 1% miner who does, and they're going to get paid a lot more because these transactions are like half of block space in many cases or more. Um, and they're going to just outperform all the other miners. They're going to have more money to buy more hash rate. They're going to grow much faster, and all the other miners are either going to have to succumb and do the same thing or just go out of business. And so, yeah, I mean, it would be nice if we had a way to prevent these transactions, but we don't. It's not technologically possible. We could block the ways that people currently uh, include transactions from the mempool. It wouldn't stop people from getting it to miners. It wouldn't stop miners from mining it. But even if miners did stop mining it, there are other ways people can embed data in the blockchain that we can't stop, that we can't detect until it's too late, until after the data is already there.
Yeah, I just have a hard time like following the lens of argument here, just because it seems like I mean, again, I wasn't around during sort of the original op return discussion, but it seems like there was always kind of this idea that people were putting arbitrary data on the blockchain to either anchor other kind of cryptocurrency systems or to allow sort of other kind of blockchains to kind of root into Bitcoin. That seemed very normative from what I remember from like 2013 to 2016. That this was kind of just regular parlance. Like nobody thought that this was a strange idea. You have Peter Todd and kind of people talking about open timestamps and kind of like the original counterparties of the day, which were anchoring data in a Bitcoin. I don't recall that those were seen as terribly predatory. I don't know. What is your view on this?
Yeah, I there's always been some concern over tail risks from these systems, whether it's the state, if you have some stable coin or you have these systems on top of Bitcoin that have more economic value than Bitcoin, it might dictate which side of a fork wins, and it might put pressure on Bitcoin to go in a way that's maybe not good for Bitcoin itself. So I think there's always been a little bit of an underlying worry that there's tail risks here, but not immediate worry from the types of things people are actually doing, because the reality is they haven't negatively affected Bitcoin, and I don't think anyone's ever been concerned that they were, at super imminent risk of doing so. But that said, there's always, of course, been, but there's also, but much more importantly, I think there's always been a recognition that we can't do anything about it. And so, making op return standard to begin with was about saying, okay, you're going to do this. You people who want to anchor other financial systems in Bitcoin or whatever, you're going to do this. We're going to give you a way to do it better so that it has less negative impact on Bitcoin. Um, and that's what Bitcoin Core is still talking about doing today, is like making sure that people who want to do this have a way to do it that has the least negative impact on Bitcoin, because they're going to do it either way. And yeah, there's some tail risks there, but probably it'll be okay. Probably it'll be fine.
Well, but what would you say? It seems like there's a group of people who don't like the harm reduction approach, right? They sort of want Bitcoin
Yeah.
Core to sort of make some declaration that this is not what Bitcoin is for. Like, what is your view on
Yeah, I mean, a Bitcoin Core could make all the declarations it wants to, and it wouldn't change anything. I mean, I think it's true that, I think there's a crowd that doesn't like the harm reduction approach. They probably also don't like harm reduction approaches to real life problems like drug users. But at least in that case, it's like, okay, well, if your view is that all these drug users should just kill themselves, then the harm reduction approach prevents them from killing themselves. And we could just stop doing the harm reduction approach, more of them will overdose, and then like you would get your way. In this case, if you stop doing the harm reduction approach, you're not going to get your way. It'll still happen. The only issue is that it happens worse. And if you were worried about it impacting Bitcoin in some negative way, well, now it does impact Bitcoin in a negative way. Before there was some tail risk that like it might cause Bitcoin transactions to get a little more expensive, or it might it might become a large portion of block space in a way that impacts soft forks or something. Yeah, those might happen, but it's not like a major issue for Bitcoin. Um, Whereas if they start bloating the UTXO set a lot more in ways that they're not going to clean up, yeah, that starts to actually impact full nodes. It starts to actually impact people's ability to run nodes. It starts to impact the ability of mining to become decentralized, let alone remain as decentralized as it is, even though it's not all that decentralized. Um, those are way more important issues. And so we should at least do the harm reduction. And we can do the harm reduction and also put out a statement that says, I don't work on Bitcoin Core anymore. But Bitcoin Core could put out a statement that says, "Don't do this. Really bad. Don't do this." But it wouldn't change anything. People would still do it.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it's been interesting watching these kind of arguments play out. But maybe one last question on the subject is this idea that kind of people who are running Bitcoin nodes should have some sort of say into what they are kind of there's this idea that they're being coerced or sort of forced to kind of host data for the network. And I mean, my view would be that if you're running the protocol, you're sort of essentially agreeing to the rules to begin with. But what would you say to people who want to sort of assert their rights as someone who runs a node?
Yeah, I think that's basically true. Like the reality is the protocol is going to put that data in the blocks, and you're going to have it. If you don't want it in your mempool, you don't have to have a mempool. You can run blocks only. It doesn't change your full node much. Um, it doesn't sound like Bitcoin Core is gonna remove the option. Um, Maybe they will, but it sounds like they won't. So you can still change the option. You can configure it. You can say no op returns, but you can shout into the wind all you want. If you want to do that, you can absolutely do that. You can patch Bitcoin Core. You could run whatever software you want. No one's stopping you from doing that. You're just shouting into the wind, but that's totally fine. If that's what you want to do, you do that. Feel
Mm.
better about yourself.
Uh, Maybe kind of coming to the end here, just this idea that we've talked about this a few times. This idea of like Bitcoin maximalism, kind of where it's going. What is it? I think last time we caught up on the subject seriously, it was probably at the beginning of 2022. I think I was a bit more convinced that maybe we were moving towards an ecosystem that looked more Bitcoin only. You were perhaps a bit jaded on that at that point. I mean, obviously, seeing things like the Bitcoin conference, where the entirety of the crypto industry is sort of, I think now kind of coming to this idea that Bitcoin is unique, where we're not really seeing those elements of the community kind of attack Bitcoin anymore openly. The good folks at Ripple donated their hate skull that they that they made, right, as some sort of appeasement. I don't know, right? Bitcoin maximalism, I think, really started, I would argue, as this effort to sort of, see if Bitcoin could become all the things, right? Obviously, that hasn't happened, but at the same time, Bitcoin is now more valuable and more interesting and more useful than all the other things. Are you a Bitcoin maximalist these days?
Yeah, I've always taken the view that Bitcoin was different. I don't think at any point in my career I'd thought that Bitcoin was somehow competing at the same game with every other cryptocurrency. We talked about this a little bit ago. I think that I haven't changed my view there. Um, the rest of the world has come around to my view. um, but I think, but on the flip side of that, for a long time, my view has been that, all these other cryptocurrencies are competing in a different game than us. And that's great. They can service the products and the services. They can provide the services that people want that require a different set of trade-offs. Whether it be a stablecoin platform, like other cryptocurrencies are great as stablecoin platforms. You don't need a totally decentralized system for a stablecoin platform. The stablecoin's super centralized. You have one counterparty in your issuer. You can make a ton of trade-offs at the platform layer to make it much more centralized. It doesn't impact the stablecoin's censorship resist, doesn't impact its properties at all. Um, just as an example, there's other things people want to build on other cryptocurrencies. Um, and that's fine. People can totally build other stuff on other cryptocurrencies. It doesn't need to annoy us. There's definitely been times when I've been frustrated that I thought the broader cryptocurrency ecosystem hasn't recognized that Bitcoin's playing in a different game, that people were dismissive of that. They didn't understand that like Bitcoin is different. It's doing something different. Um, and now it seems like most people do recognize that, do agree with that, see value in that. I really appreciate that. I'm happy that people see value in the thing that Bitcoin does that's different.
Well, I was saying I think there's such a weird. I feel a real dissonance on these points of late because I feel like simultaneously there's never been more of an agreement within the cryptocurrency industry outside Bitcoin that Bitcoin is special and unique. That is now sort of consensus mainstream in the alternative crypto world in a way that it has not been. Right? I would say pretty much 2014 on, the cryptocurrency community was expressly hostile and antithetical to Bitcoin and saw itself as replacing Bitcoin. And I'd say that, if you listen to a Bankless podcast from a few years ago, it's pretty clear that was the normative view. And so there's been a huge capitulation on that side. But something that I think is equally interesting is that simultaneously while that's happening, there's been sort of this interesting argument within Bitcoin to this idea that sort of it's the culture of Bitcoin that is the reason that it has maintained decentralization, and it is the culture of Bitcoin that sort of separates Bitcoin from other cryptocurrencies. Like that is the differentiator. It's specifically this Bitcoin culture, right? And I think these sort of Bitcoin knots crowd evokes this argument a lot, where they say, all these other cryptocurrencies could have succeeded, but they failed because they didn't have cultures of decentralization, right? That's sort of the claim that they're making. Just curious for your thoughts on this idea, because it does seem like both of these groups have changed their thinking on this pretty radically. But within Bitcoin, there's this idea that like our culture has somehow preserved us or differentiated us.
I mean, I think, I've always pointed out that the block size wars were about setting that culture. It was about setting the culture of how Bitcoin changes. Like how do we define Bitcoin? How do we decide changes to Bitcoin? And we won, right? That the people who thought that Bitcoin should only be changed through a conservative process with a large broad scale agreement, et cetera, uh, won that war, and that set define the culture, that really said, look, either you don't think that should be the culture of Bitcoin, in which case Bcash is that way, go ahead, or you do think Bitcoin should not compromise on decentralization, should really hold these goals to be the only goal, and everything else is secondary. Um, and those were the people who stuck with Bitcoin and continued to work on Bitcoin and have defined the culture of Bitcoin. And I do think that that is uniquely different. There's not necessarily a huge technical gap between
I don't know
Bitcoin
why, but I just
and
instinctively sort of hate this idea that like the Bitcoin culture somehow made. I agree with everything you said, because I agree with what you're saying, right? I also think that the fork wars were sort of a formative period in Bitcoin, and that we as a collective culture didn't really understand Bitcoin before that. So that I very much agree with. But then I sort of equally sort of balk at this idea that it's, because again, it's sort of the argument is like, well, we are Bitcoin, and therefore because we sort of did this thing, like Bitcoin is special, you know what I mean? And I don't know, I just It seems like you're comfortable with that. You're comfortable saying that like we made the right decisions, like we created the right culture, and that culture is Bitcoin.
I think that's true. I think eh, I don't
Well,
know,
doesn't
we
that sort of
made the
accept that
culture.
like
Like
it
we
could be created again or something else? Because I don't know if you're saying like, well, we did this thing, then that it seems like what you're saying is that thing could be replicated, right? Like, well, if other people just adopted
Yeah,
ideas, then that would just be similar to Bitcoin, no?
I, I think it has turned out that it is rather hard to replicate that. But at the same time, I just don't think people really try. Like most other cryptocurrencies don't try, not in a serious way and not coming in understanding Bitcoin. There's a lot of other cryptocurrencies that have said, we're going to replace Bitcoin, we're better than Bitcoin, but they haven't started by actually understanding Bitcoin, by understanding this conservatism and uh, carefulness around changes and prioritization of decentralization above all else. It seems like most of the people trying to compete with Bitcoin never understood Bitcoin and thus end up building something that's not even remotely competitive with Bitcoin. So, yeah, someone could try, but I think A, no one really has, and B, maybe more importantly, okay, B, um, no one who understands Bitcoin would try to compete with Bitcoin because Bitcoin's already here. Why would you build from here to get to here when like there's no really value in building a new thing aside from to enrich yourself, and then you're going to end up building something that's not competitive with Bitcoin. But I think finally and most importantly, that the value of Bitcoin's culture isn't something I think to argue with your point a little bit, it's not necessarily something that we created. It's not that we created it and said like, well, we the 10 Bitcoiners who've been around for a long time or whatever, we came down from on high and said this should be the culture, and people who agreed with that used Bitcoin. It was through blood, sweat, and tears that we fought for that culture. And most importantly, it was the people who agreed with that culture, who wanted a cryptocurrency like that and had those properties, who decided to use Bitcoin, and who then defined the culture by being involved in Bitcoin. That culture comes from a large number of people sharing that culture and a large number of people viewing Bitcoin through this lens of conservatism and decentralization. Um, Other people, if you didn't agree with that, you probably left. You went to some other cryptocurrency, and that's great. People self-selected into what they wanted to use and what properties they cared about. Um, but yeah, I just don't think I don't think it's replicable because because in order to get I think what I'm trying to say is in order to get this decentralization and strength that Bitcoin has that puts Bitcoin apart, sets Bitcoin apart, you have to have a lot of people who view that as important and who are going to scream at each other on Twitter. And you can't just snap your fingers and create that. You have to build a very large community of diverse people who care about a product over many, 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 many years. And so, is it impossible to build another Bitcoin? No, I don't think it's impossible. But somehow you have to get all these people to be interested and to have that as their goal. And all these people are already interested in anyone who cares strongly about these things is already interested in Bitcoin. They're not going to go work on something else. Um, so I don't think it's really practical to build a new competitor to Bitcoin, but I don't think it's just because it was immaculately created or something. I think it's just over time, and it took a long time for it to get there, and a lot of work on a lot from a lot of people. But most importantly, it took growing the community and growing a community of people who care about Bitcoin and aren't just here to make money and aren't just here because they heard about Bitcoin and it's interesting and its number go up and whatever. But I mentioned in Vegas, it really felt like people are starting to care about Bitcoin. People who got involved in Bitcoin because of number go up or whatever care, and a lot of people seem to care, and a lot of people seem to care about these properties that matter, the decentralization and trustlessness and whatever, and that I think that's what makes Bitcoin strong and unique.
Well, of course, this conversation, one of the many reasons I don't envy your position to try to explain some of this stuff to policymakers. But maybe as a last call to action, what's up next for the Blockchain Regulatory Clarity Act? How can people go and support what you're doing to make sure we can keep
Certainty,
building
you keep.
Bitcoin? Oh, certainty. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act. Up next, we need people to call. We need people to pick up the phone and call Congress. Honestly, we need people to make clear that this group of broad, diverse viewpoints in Bitcoin cares about this uniquely and specifically, and we want the our regulators to pass this law. We want Congress to pass this law. Um, so really, I mean, the next step is people need to go to saveourwallets.org. They need to type in their zip code. They need to pick up the phone and call. It takes 5 minutes. It's not hard. You just got to pick up the phone, say, I care about this. 2 sentences why. The website has plenty of sentences. You can just read the website. Doesn't matter. Um, so that's next. After, as we continue to build momentum there, Coin Center, DeFi Education Fund, this isn't just impacting Bitcoin, it impacts all cryptocurrency. And so a lot of these organizations do have the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act as their top priority this year, as the thing they're pushing hardest for. Allies in Congress are helping push for it. It's hard to get floor space. There's other things Congress has to do. There's a whole big bill going on right now. They got to get the debt ceiling increased. They got to pass a budget, all the usual congressional stuff. Um, so, we got to fight it. We got to make sure that they feel the pressure, that they understand this is important, so that when they do get a spare minute, hopefully soon after this big bill passes on the Senate side, and after they do reconciliation, then we'll get our minute and we'll be able to get them to vote on it. But really, we need them to feel the pressure.
We'll go out, support the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act. So I can make sure I get it right the second time. Appreciate you being on the podcast. Always a pleasure, Matt. And this has been Supply Shock, a Blockworks podcast.